Good afternoon. I am host Dyke Hendrickson, and this is the podcast Life Along the Merrimack. I am the outreach historian for the Custom House Maritime Museum. We tried to bring history out of the museum and into the community. Frequently, I have guests, but today I will be talking about some developments along the river, and I will address some of my projects as relate to the Merrimack River. I have just returned from 2 weeks at another barrier island. Plum Island here is a barrier island, of course, and I visited New Smyrna Beach, Florida, also a barrier island. It is quite similar to Plum Island. It is about 9 miles long. The Indian River runs past it at its northern edge. And the southern part of the island is run by the U.S. National Park Service, just as we have here. In fact, the pass that I use to get onto Plum Island works at that retreat, which is called the Canaveral National Seashore. So it's near Cape Canaveral, the Space Center, but across a bay. One natural asset that this preserve possesses is the presence of armadillos. It's true. I saw several of the armored rats when driving by. Little known fact. Armadillos can cause leprosy. This is true. I've even, I mentioned this to people after I saw a story in the local newspaper about the leprosy rate going up. I said, what is going on? And I checked Wikipedia. About a dozen cases of leprosy are reported each year in that area. And it turns out that if you pick up an armadillo or if he secretes some of his nasty juices on you, you might get leprosy. Now, I was going to pick up an armadillo just to take a selfie, but then I remembered the dire medical warning. So I did not, but I do look at them every year I go down there. Their rivers contain dolphins and manatees, and the sky is full of brown pelicans, which until recently was an endangered species. So it's an interesting place to go to. I can use my pass that I got at Plum Island. And I just mention it because there's a lot of nature and rivers and dunes out there. And I just visited my sister in New Smyrna Beach, Florida, is where it is, about 10 miles south of Daytona Beach, and I had a great time. Now, regarding the Merrimack River and the Coast Guard, my book, New England Coast Guard Stories, will be released March 15th. It's been a while. But it'll be at the local Jabberwocky bookstore, and right now it's on Amazon. Sad to report that the book rack on the corner of State and Pleasant is now moribund or closed. This happened several months ago, but I guess, if you're involved in books and reading and writing and stuff, just to see a bookshop close is pretty bad. So this summer I will be speaking in numerous places, and I've been contacted by historical institutions in Bath, Maine, and in Boston, at a yacht club, actually, in Dorchester. The Maine Maritime Museum in Bath has invited me for early August, and I'm thrilled by this. It's a chance for me to talk about the book, and as we know, there aren't as many bookstores where you can go and talk. So I am going to be doing that in Bath, Maine, and in Dorchester, and I think other things will come in. Provincetown, Massachusetts, Newport, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Rockland, Maine. These are places I'm going to be talking. And, of course, I will always be saying that Newburyport is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. Locally, we don't have many bookstores left, but I am tentatively going to be signing books during the Newburyport Literary Festival on April 25th. The site of this book signing is a little different than most authors. It is a Thirsty Whale on Lower State Street. Now, it used to be a little unsavory there, but it's much improved. And so I think my feeling is at the end of a day, and if you've been to the literary festival, you've probably listened to speakers, you've listened to panels, and at 5 o'clock, you might want to rest your mind, but exercise your drinking hand. So I'm going to be there at 5 o'clock signing books. Now this, is they do have a room to do that. I haven't decided whether I'm going to have it illustrated or not. I do have a 40-minute presentation with illustrated slides, but I don't know that that would be so cool to be doing. But I think I'll give a 10 cent, people might consider it worth 10 cents, a 10-minute presentation, and then people can spring to the bar. Or they might go to the bar first. At any rate, that's my plan. It's going to be a book signing. I'm excited about it, and it's a good way for me to meet people. And again, this is Dyke Hendrickson, and the program is Life Along the Merrimack. This is 96.3 FM, and the video can be seen on YouTube. So I am excited about the research of my next book as well. It is called Merrimack, the Resilient River. I have a contract with Fonthill Media in Charleston, South Carolina. And I'm researching that now. Today is March 3rd, and it's just a beautiful day. And you almost think it's spring. In fact, some of the daffodils are coming up at the Newburyport Library. But, you know, it's a wonderful thing, and I'm excited about writing this book about the Merrimack River, because one element of it is it's going to be largely in color. I've written 5 books. All of them have been in black and white. But the publisher I have now wants color photos. And that is very unusual if you're a writer, because in the past, color has cost much more than black and white. And if you even wanted, 6 or 8 color photos inside of your book, the expense of publishing it went up enormously. But these people actually, the woman I work with said, well, it costs no more to do a color photo than to do a black and white photo, which I have never heard before, but was greatly heartened. So one of the things I'm going to do is use aerial color photos. There'll be about 60 photos in this book on the Merrimack. I've met with a fellow here in town, Newburyport, who has a drone business. And what he does is he sends his drone up and it takes photos. And he has some incredibly good photos already about Newburyport Harbor, Salisbury Beach, Amesbury. And again, they're in color and they're really spectacular. And so I think the book is going to have a different look. I'm also going to have historical photos. And some of the people that I want to highlight, are some older folk. Alexander Hamilton would be one. He's the father of the Coast Guard. There are more, in more modern times, Senator Ed Muskie from Maine. That's at the other end of the years, almost. But, he'll be another one who had a big effect on our river. So one of my first decisions, and I may have made it in my own mind, is where do you start? Do you start here in Newburyport and Salisbury where the river ends, or do you start up in Franklin, New Hampshire, that's well past Manchester, and start it there? So I have decided to start it in Newburyport. Number one, I live here. Number two, the scenes of summer in Plum Island and Newburyport and Salisbury and Amesbury, they're fabulous. I think we know that. That's one of the reasons we live here. And I'm just, and I've seen a dozen of these, and it's very exciting. You can see the inlet at Plum Island from the air on a sunny day. You can look at the beach in Salisbury. You can go up and learn more about the downtown of Newburyport. I mean, there are 1,500 pleasure vessels tied up in Newburyport each summer, and more over in Salisbury and Amesbury. So we tend to overlook it, or I do, since I don't have a boat. But there are many boats here, and so this is a boating community, a recreational community of the highest order. So I think it's going to be interesting to show that. In addition, we have a very large marsh. This is the largest marsh we have at the eastern end here, north of New Jersey, meaning it's the largest in New England. 25,000 acres, I'm told. And so we all know marshes are important for fish, for birds, for everything. Very few of us have ever been over the marshes. And I think that'll be interesting. What does our river look like when we can't see it? Now, some people go on boating trips and do see more. Last fall, you may remember, a group of city, state, federal officials and educators called the Voyagers actually got into kayaks up in Franklin, New Hampshire, and came down the river. Now, the river's 117 miles long. They were trying to bring attention to the fact it's getting more polluted, not less polluted. And the reason for that is the sewage treatment plants, which were built 3 or 4 decades ago, now take the water runoff from the rain as well as the sewage. So because of global warming, we have more rainstorms in the spring and early summer, and the more intense. So you get tremendous amounts of water going into the sewage treatment plants. They can't handle it, and they discharge the untreated effluent, to put it nicely. And the Environmental Protection Agency knows about this. It's not like this is something that people aren't aware of, but it's happening a little more each year, and I think as more people realize how valuable the river is to the economy of the Merrimack Valley, people are saying we've got to do more. And I've had some key people involved. State Senator Linda DeZoglio was on our podcast here. Others have been here to talk about it, some historians, some people who own boats, and people are concerned. Now, I mentioned Muskie, and the reason I mentioned him is because he was the one. Now, this goes back to 1972. It's election day, so we can talk about these things. And he was able to provide leadership to pass a bill called the Clean Water Act of 1972. Billions of dollars were released, and that's how many of the communities here, up in Maine, where he was from, and other communities got their sewage treatment plants. Now, in those days, following 1972, they were grants. In other words, the feds would supply about 90% of the money, and towns, perhaps states, would chip in the other 10. In 1987, during the Reagan administration, that was changed, and this funding of sewage treatment plants was changed to loans. So that program of loans to local communities is still operative. In fact, local federal officials are saying, we're applying for some of those loans to improve the sewage treatment plants. But as I think there's a big difference to taxpayers between a loan and a grant. A grant, you get the money, you cash the check, and the building starts. With a loan, much has to be done. There has to be some significant buy-in by the community. And so, improving yourself by loans is so much more difficult. Now, I should point out that one idea that isn't getting too much currency, but a guest on this show, Peter Doyle, who's smart about the river and lives down on Plum Island, suggested, why don't we consider taxing local communities a small amount so there will be an escrow for improving sewage treatment plants. And he mentioned that Boston had done that. Now, this goes back 20 years. But nevertheless, you might recall that Boston Harbor was one of the dirtiest harbors in the United States. It was awful. It was polluted. The Charles River was awful. But the political awareness changed, and so there was kind of I wouldn't call it a tax because everyone hates that word, but there was a surcharge, shall we say. And the Boston Water District and the Boston Sewerage District started collecting money. They started making improvements. So much of the cleanup of the Boston Harbor came from private funding. And so I haven't heard this suggestion out there that often, except on this glorious program. But maybe in the next year, people will start doing that, because it does not look like the national administration right now is going to be going into a grant program. In fact, some of the safeguards the EPA has had, Environmental Protection Agency, has had for dozens of years are being rolled back now. So it would be naive to think federal grants will come. But it might be a thought to have communities go to their taxpayers, their voters, and say, look, we have to do this. So anyway, I like thinking about the river because, number one, it's a great resource. It's one reason why a lot of us are here. We were intrigued by the river, by the ocean, by the beaches, and we want it to stay clean and healthy. And another reason is there has to be more information put out about the river. Most of us don't know so much about it. I mean, that's why this program started, actually, to talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. So here we are. But one theme that I'm going to be pursuing in my new book, which is called Merrimack, the Resilient River, is, and by the way, I am, in my own mind, thinking about this as the third part of a trilogy, the Merrimack Trilogy. This will be my third book focusing on the river. The first was Nautical Newburyport. The second, which will be out in 2 weeks, is New England Coast Guard Stories. And this is going to be Merrimack, the Resilient River, the Merrimack Trilogy. And at any rate, I'm excited. I have a lot of photos garnered. I've talked to a lot of people. Having this show is very helpful because I get to talk to newsmakers and people involved. So one theme of my new book about the river is that Newburyport was a leading shipbuilder in the colonies in the 18th century. The Coast Guard started here in 1790 with construction of the revenue cutter, the Massachusetts. But it's one thing we can never forget. This is the birthplace of the Coast Guard, and it was chosen by Alexander Hamilton, the father of the Coast Guard, and George Washington, in part because Newburyporters were very active in the Revolution. That was ended about in 1787. We sent ships to help the colonies. We sent men and supplies. So in my view, it was no accident that Newburyport was chosen as one of the first places to build these revenue cutters. There were 10 of them ordered by George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. 2 of them were actually built in Newburyport. That's why we are the birthplace of the Coast Guard. And if you meet anyone from Marblehead or any people from Newport or wherever, it is a fact. There is a plaque at the Maritime Museum here in Newburyport, signed by President Lyndon Johnson in 1965, which formally designated Newburyport as the birthplace. So I still hear it from people, geez, is it really the birthplace? I didn't know that. And yes, it is really the birthplace. And maybe my book on the Coast Guard will help that to be realized. Maybe my other book on the Merrimack River will help. Another theme of my Merrimack River book is on the banks of the Merrimack River started the Industrial Revolution. Now, we remember this as factories and making cloth, making shoes. But in the 1820s, engineers harnessed the hydropower of the Merrimack, and enormous mills were built. And I think today, driving through Lowell and Lawrence and Manchester, New Hampshire, I mean, these were enormous mills. It started in the 1820s. In fact, Henry David Thoreau wrote a famous book called A Week Traveling Along the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. He wrote it in 1839. It was published in 1849, but we won't go into the nuances of publishing because it can give people like me headaches. Anyway, in 1839, he wrote this book, and he had traveled there, say, in the early 1830s. And they went on the Concord River, which was cool enough, and then the Concord runs into the Merrimack, and they started going down the Merrimack River, and they saw all these mills along the banks of the Merrimack. Now, granted, the mills started in the 1820s, but by the 1830s, there was, quite a complex, and you could see the sewage starting to come out into the river. So Thoreau, and this is long, long ago in 1839 said, you know, this is messing up the fish because they can't get upstream. It is making the water very dirty in the river. Maybe there'll be a time thousands of years from now when the fish will outlive the factories. So that hasn't happened yet. Well, it's not thousands of years yet, but it is a long time, almost 200. So that's one of those things. He saw in 1839 that pollution was starting and that the bucolic nature of the river was disappearing. But that was an enormous thing when hydropower was harnessed. They could create these mills and these spinning and weaving rooms for cotton and for wool and for many things. And of course, with cotton and wool came the dyes that colored these cloths. And they, of course, at the end of the day, they would just throw the dye into the river. Now, this is reprehensible to us now, but I remember reading some remarks from an owner of a factory, and he said, well, yeah, it's making the river colored, and we frequently see fish, dead on top of the river, but this is part of the industrial world. We give people jobs, we create cloth for them. This is just what happens. So if you're looking back on it that way, that was the rationale, and that's why it got started. So the Industrial Revolution started here in the 20s. Another theme of the book, Merrimack, the Resilient River, will be the first research in the country on the creation of clean drinking water occurred in Lawrence in the 1890s. This is the whole country. I'm not making this up. Families were getting typhoid from drinking their water from the very polluted Merrimack River. But the state of Massachusetts started seeing these statistics of kids and families dying of typhoid, and they got a commission together. We all hate commissions, but sometimes they actually work. And engineers from this region, several of them from MIT, developed the first regimen for cleaning and testing water for human consumption. Now, that was in the 1890s. So for many, many years, people were drinking polluted water. And so I am going to stress that, in part because I didn't know about it. But it's remarkable. And even today, more than 500,000 people in the Merrimack Valley get their drinking water from the Merrimack River. Most of those are in Lawrence and the Andovers. So it's still an effective system, but that's another thing that I wasn't aware of, that we have a very dirty river out there because they're below Manchester, they're below Lowell. I'm talking Lawrence now. And so it's a situation where, they always have to have their eyes on science and always have to make sure the drinking water is clean. Now, I would mention, since we're in Newburyport, Newburyport does not get its drinking water from the Merrimack. We get it from the Artichoke and a couple other nearby sources. And so we are not necessarily, in a bind. And we also have a clean sewage cleanup system, as do Salisbury and Amesbury. I must point this out. We have situations that the river water is largely separated from the water, that comes down the river, or when it rains hard, it's separated. So it is true that sometimes we get the brunt of it. 5 or 6 years ago, I used to work for the Daily News here in Newburyport, and Mayor Donna Holliday and a group were driving along after 3 heavy days of rain, and the river was very brown. And like she and others said, what is going on? What's the science here? I know we're at the end of the river, but we're having a brown river now? So she was among the early ones who started walking backwards, and among the things they found, everyone kind of knew that the sewage was getting into the river, but there were no warnings of this. In fact, until the last year or two, these sewage treatment plants in Lowell and Lawrence and Manchester and Nashua, they didn't have to tell anybody. They would release it. They would release a couple million gallons. The amount of effluent would be significant, but they wouldn't tell anybody. I mean, there are enough boaters, I've got to tell you this, in Newburyport Harbor and Plum Island who could tell you when the sewage was there. In fact, these voyagers, which I mentioned earlier, they themselves saw some effluent, and I respect scatological guidelines, so I won't be too frank here, but the river can get very dirty. Anyway, I just point that out. Also, another theme of my book on the Merrimack will be organized labor started along the Merrimack River. Now, owners took advantage of the workers for many years. That's nothing new. In 1835, women, who mostly inhabited the mills in the 1830s, say through 1870s, because they'd work for 4 or 5 years and go back to their farms, young women. This is before the immigrants started coming. But, they would get tired of it, and bless them for it. And they had several small work stoppages. This is from 1835, say, to 1860. Women it was, who were doing among the first labor movements in the country. Now, in 1912, once the immigrants came, many different groups were working. Thousands of people work in Lowell, Lawrence. They did have a work stoppage. It's called the Red Rose Strike. And they struck because the mill owners were actually cutting their pay. Now, I should point out their hours were being cut by 2 hours. But still, the understanding had been, all right, we're going to work 2 hours less. But they didn't tell the workers that, you're going to be getting less money. So they struck, and it was a huge strike. It was thousands went off the job in Lowell and Lawrence. And it's quite famous. National labor organizers came to Lawrence, and what got a lot of publicity, and remember, I'm an old newsman, so this would appeal to me as well. A lot of workers sent their kids out of town. They feared violence. They feared fires. They feared getting beat up because a lot of state police were here to support the owners. But this was one that the workers won, not in a big way, but it is considered the first labor movement in this country, and started by women, 40 or 50 years earlier, finished by a polyglot of ethnic groups, French, Italians, Greeks, Armenians, Irish, you name it. Many of us know this, that all sorts of different ethnic groups settled in Lawrence and Lowell. And so that was an interesting element I will write about. The other element that I'm going to write about, which I just talked about briefly, the Clean Water Act of 1972, which Senator Ed Muskie was the lead sponsor, and he engineered grants, not loans, and they were responsible for cleaning the rivers. A theme for 2020 is pollution levels of the river are rising. City, state, and federal officials are seeking funds to improve their treatment plants. They're not getting many grants yet, but I think there's a consciousness growing. And I've been to several of these meetings, and they're full. There are 150, 160 people. You can't get another chair into the room. I mean, there is a momentum building. So that's why, I'm kind of proud that we have Life Along the Merrimack as a podcast. We talk about the health and history of the river. And so we have some exciting things coming up in the future. And I'm, regret to say that our time is about up. 30 minutes goes fast. I mean, Rush Limbaugh can do it, so I guess I can. Excuse me, I take that back, and I'll be flogged when I get home. But I just did want to talk about those things: the Coast Guard, the harbor, the history of the river, the history of pollution on the river, and some of the things that we're going to be doing in the future. So next time, in fact, I had actually brought along a very interesting article, or so I think, about the Merrimack River has been a hub of recreation for centuries. I wrote this story 4 or 5 years ago, and it's because today was such a warm day, it'll probably hit 60. I was thinking about boats and getting outside. So I took, this story that I'd written a few years ago for the Daily News about the whole history of recreation, of boats, of fishing, of sightseeing, the whole thing. So I think I'll read that next week. That'll be fun. For now, though, we're finished with Life Along the Merrimack. This is 96.3 FM. Thank you very much. I'm Dyke Hendrickson, and we will gather again next week. Thank you.